Welcome everyone to the Remedy Book Club. In this series, we will be looking at other forms of media that have a similar feel to the Remedy connected universe. These can be books, films, TV shows, really anything that gives us the same vibe. The intention of this series is to break down other stories and analyze how they are similar to the games we love. It is also a good opportunity to introduce everyone to other things that you may find interesting if you're a fan of the RCU. There will be spoilers ahead. If you have not experienced this video's piece of media yourself and would like to, I recommend pausing and reading or watching them before coming back. If you would like to be included in the club itself, everyone on Patreon has access to the material in advance so that we can all go through it together. We also have an exclusive area of the Discord to discuss them as we go. With all that out of the way, let's get into the 1994 supernatural slasher flick, Wes Craven's New Nightmare. It probably is not a shock to anyone, but out of the classic slasher franchises, Nightmare on Elm Street is my personal favorite, mostly because of its focus on dream logic and lucid dreaming in general. But that, in and of itself, is not the reason why the 7th installment in the Nightmare franchise made the cut for our little Remedy Book Club. New Nightmare has far too many narrative and thematic similarities to the plot of Alan Wake 2, it is kind of absurd. All we have to do is swap two of the characters with one another and the plots exist within an overlap themselves. Replace Saga and Heather and Wes Craven with Alan Wake. You see, this film is not set in the universe of the Elm Street series, it is set in real life, focusing on the actors from the films. While there are many, the main ones to focus on are Heather Langenkamp, who played Nancy Thompson in the first and third films, John Saxon, who plays Lieutenant Thompson in the same movies, Robert Englund, who is Freddy himself, and Wes Craven playing himself. We learn quickly at the beginning of the film that the entire Nightmare and Elm Street series ended with the 6th installment. Freddy's Dead, the final nightmare officially concluded the original series. Several years have passed and the fandom has been begging for a new installment. But with the primary antagonist officially killed off, there is nowhere left for the plot to go. This mirrors Alan killing off Alex Casey in order to move on to something new, but the fans either refusing to believe it or begging him to bring the character back. In the Alan Wake survival guide, Rose says as much to him upon their first meeting in the diner. This itself is a reflection of Misery by Stephen King, which has the same premise. Despite not having been involved in the franchise since the third film, Heather is invited by this film studio and informed that Wes Craven is writing a new script, and they want her involved. In the months leading up to this point, she has been having reoccurring nightmares, experiencing disturbing calls from a stalker related to the films, and unnatural earthquakes have been rocking the area where she lives. It turns out that all of these occurrences started when Wes began writing his new script. You see, the stories he writes comes from his own nightmares. Every night he has a horrifying dream, then writes it down as the next scene in his new script. This nightmare involves Heather herself and word for word follows her life and what she has been experiencing. It seems almost too obvious to comment on, but I'll do it anyway. Saga Anderson coming to Bright Falls and finding a manuscript written by Alan that details her every action. Her feelings, what she says. As a child, Alan's nightmares inspired his stories. Now he uses echoes of the plot as inspiration. Many artists claim that their fiction originates from their dreams, a place where the mind taps into a creative wellspring of the unconscious, a well that both Alan and Wes drink from. So far in common we have meta-narrative, check. Hero learning they are a character in someone else's story, check. Let's see what else we can find. Separate from this whole scenario, Robert Englund is having his own experience. He has been having his own nightmares and takes to painting to express them. The images coming to him, illustrating the new villain of the story. While it looks like a more twisted version of the character he played, it is something entirely different. This is not Freddy. Before moving forward onto the nature of this new villain, I want to comment on the paintings. Back in the Cauldron Lake Lodge, there's a man by the name of Rudolph Lane. He is a painter with a block that was taken in by Dr. Hartman. He could no longer express his ideas on canvas. Hartman tried to have him work on landscapes to get his creative juices flowing. However, the moment that Alan arrived in town and began writing, he was struck by sudden inspiration. His art can be found all over Hartman's office. The Doctor believes that the inspiration came directly from Departure, and Lane became an illustrator for the book, painting scenes and monsters directly from the pages of the author without realizing where the ideas were coming from. Robert Englund is, in essence, illustrating the new script that Wes is writing, paving in an identical way to Rudolph Lane. I mentioned earlier that despite having the same image, behavior, and weapon as Freddy, this villain, as Wes wrote him, is not the same killer from the film franchise. It is something else entirely wearing the face of Freddy. Something far, far older than the character first envisioned in the early 80s. Something much darker and more evil. From what I have read, he only wrote the first film and co-wrote the third. Outside of these, others came in to handle the character he created. This is why we see a radical transformation between the sadistic killer of the first movie to the wisecracking meme of a character he was by the end. The character was never intended to be a pop icon that the fans saw as funny. In this new story, Wes brings back the evil with a vengeance. Moving back, on Mr. Door's talk show, Alan acknowledges a similar sentiment. He only wrote the books. The movies, however, he had little to no involvement in.
They're their own thing. They've gone with choices that are different from mine. I guess I just wish I could have been more involved in making them.
It can be difficult to see a character you created be transformed into something else. Something you never intended. Even if done in a respectful way, the author knows the character better than anyone. Everything else produced by others is simply an interpretation of the source material, sometimes even outright changing the characterization into something unrecognizable. Like what happened to Freddy Krueger between the beginning and the end of the series. In Wes's dreams, this version of Freddy is darker, more evil. It feels like an author trying to get the character back on track, reclaim his creation and return it to where it was intended. But now it must be done in a new form. His nightmares and the script he is writing centers on an old eldritch entity. No name is given for it, but this entity has taken many forms throughout humanity's history. Its only weakness is that it can be caught by storytellers, by artists who envision something so horrific that it captures its essence. It becomes an actor playing a role for a time, until the story is either forgotten by the public consciousness, or the character is retold and changed so many times it loses the essence which captured the entity in the first place.
Every so often they imagine a story good enough to sort of catch its essence, and then, for a while, it's held prisoner in the story.
Like the genie in the bottle.
Exactly. But the problem comes when the story dies, and that can happen in a lot of ways. It can get too familiar to people, or somebody waters it down to make it an easier sell, or however it happens when the story dies. The evil is set free.
I find it fascinating that this process is governed by the audience. In Control, groupthink and the collective focus of people is a large part of the altered phenomenon. A story that was front and center 100 years ago is all but forgotten today. Perception of a character can change. Once upon a time, fairy tale villains were considered explorations of human evil. Now, they are changed to be misunderstood victims justified in their actions. Freddy began as one thing and ended as something completely different. Underneath it all, there are archetypal forces that are expressed through these characters, an entity that is expressed through the deeds and murderous intent of Krueger. In the Remedy setting, one could make a comparison to the Dark Presence itself, an eldritch entity that requires a story to act freely. In Departure, it played the role of Barbara Jagger, aka the Scratching Hag. In American Nightmare, it played the role of a tulpa form of Mr. Scrooge. In Alan Wake 2, it played a different kind of Mr. Scrooge. Different characters being played by the same dark entity. Again, sounds familiar to the plot of this film. If this wasn't enough, there are even more direct aspects of New Nightmare that we witness firsthand in Alan Wake 2. One of the actors in the film who performed in the original series is John Saxon. In the first and third film, he portrayed Nancy's father, Lieutenant Thompson. In this new movie, he plays himself and acts as a counselor for Heather after the death of her husband. Later during the climax of the film, he meets her at her house to check in on her and her son. Over the course of the conversation, something weird happens. His entire demeanor changes. He stops calling her by her real name and begins to call her Nancy. We see that all of a sudden he has a police badge and a gun on his hip. His vehicle is suddenly a cop car. Reality has changed. For some reason, he has ceased to be John and literally became the character he portrayed in the films. Along with it, his memories of his real life.
Why are you calling me Nancy, John?
Why are you calling me John?
In all the stories leading up to Alan Wake 2, there was one detail that we never received an explanation for. That is how a person who became a character in a story was forced to play along with the script. How do they remember a false version of reality? In the new game, we learn that the memories are altered to reflect what the story says. The first time Saga meets Ilmo, he has no clue who she is, but the second time he sees her as an old friend, knowing her full fictional history, and even has the keys to her trailer. In order to properly become a character, the identity of the actor must change, replaced by the identity of the character. This means memories need to be changed too. But it isn't enough to change the people. The sets and props must change as well. There is implication that the house used for the Valhalla nursing home may not have existed before the story began. John did not have a cop car parked in front of Heather's house. He didn't have a badge or a weapon on him when he first entered. Only after a little accidental ritual was performed did this shift occur.
Fred Krueger did it, Daddy.
Yeah, sure.
Fred Krueger did it.
Yeah, sure.
The two actors accidentally played out a scene from the first film, a ritual of them falling into the role of their characters. Later, this is solidified when she realizes what is happening and goes along with the script, deciding to play the role of Nancy one last time. For Saga, this ritual was a little more involved. She took Nightingale's heart and placed it through the witch's chest as her first ritualistic act to allow the story to proceed, to continue to become real. If she refused this task, the story would have ended right there. Moving back to the film, the next ritual involves following a symbolic trail of breadcrumbs. You see, earlier in the story, Heather was reading Hansel and Gretel to her son, Dylan. But instead of the children following the breadcrumbs to find their way back home, our protagonist follows the breadcrumbs to find her son. Except, this trail is made of sleeping pills instead of bread. Real life mirroring and overlapping with a work of fiction. Once she does, Nancy finds herself in what looks like a dilapidated ruin. Columns collapsed, ancient structures cracked and falling apart. This set design is an incredible detail. On one torch, we see the word Lathe carved into it. Lathe is the name of one of the 5 major rivers in Hades, alongside the river Styx, Acheron, the Cocytus, and the Phlegethon. While this is not relevant to making a comparison to Alan Wake, I feel it is interesting to discuss anyway. You see, Lathe is the river of forgetfulness. According to Orphic tradition, the souls of the newly deceased would drink from the river Lathe and all memories of their previous lives would be washed away, preparing the soul for reincarnation. In the mystic tradition, the initiate was trained to ignore the Lathe and instead seek the river Nemesis, which ran parallel to the former. Named for the goddess of memory, it would allow the soul to retain memories of its former life before reincarnation. In doing so, all spiritual work done in the former life is carried into the new one. While this may be me overanalyzing, it feels thematically relevant considering the fact that people's memories are being altered to make them believe they are the characters they portray. John appears to have been lost to his character. He thematically drank from Lathe. Heather, while she's playing Nancy now, remembers her real life. Thematically, she drank from Nemesis. We can take this idea and make the statement that the family of Andersons drinks from the Nemesis, while all other characters like Rose, the Koskalas, Thornton, Mulligan, and Casey all drank from Lathe. Getting back to the set, we also see the words lust and anger carved into the wall, 2 of the 7 sins. These portrayed ideas from a completely different faith system. In the back of the collapsed structure is an oven taken straight from Hansel and Gretel. Trapped inside, Dylan tries to squeeze through the vent and is confronted with a serpent. Obvious allusions to the serpent in the garden. Based upon all of these conflicting set details, it becomes apparent that this place is more than it appears. In essence, it is a mushed-together image of every story this entity was ever captured by. We get a hint of what characters it played before being stuck in the role of Freddy Krueger. Greek imagery, the Christian devil, Lucifer, and even the witch from Hansel and Gretel. Just a few of the characters that managed to capture its essence. seeing this caused me to ask a question. What other characters has the Dark Presence portrayed throughout the ages? In the Remedy setting, we only see 3 characters who we can confirm the Dark Presence played. Before that, we have no information. I can almost guarantee there have been people throughout human history who have had contact with this Dark Presence. Storytelling has been around a long time. The local native tribes in Washington knew full well the power of the lake. I wonder if some of their stories captured the Dark Presence hundreds of years before the town of Bright Falls was formed. Since there are very likely other thresholds or overlaps in the Dark Place all over the world, anything is possible. With all of this said, we have one last point of interest which gives thematic echoes between the film and Alan Wake 2. Amongst the fallen columns, our hero finds a script of Wes Craven's new nightmare. She opens it and reads the manuscript inside her head, seeing scene for scene, word for word, everything that has happened or will happen. After a climactic battle, the entity is forced into the oven and burned alive just like the witch from the fairy tale. Heather and her son return back to the waking world. At the foot of the bed lies the completed script. A note from Wes thanking her for playing Nancy again. Her son, being a fan of stories, asks her to read it to him, so she flips back to page 1 and begins to read the screenplay. In doing so, the story spirals forward and begins all over again. You see, by reading the script, the narrative goes back to the beginning, continuing a tier down in reality, and as soon as Heather and Dylan finish reading, the character on page begins to read the book to her son. Around and around this goes into infinity. Even though the first Heather and Dylan go back to their life as normal once they finish reading, the story creates an infinite loop, a prison. If the story never ends, then the entity can never escape the character of Freddy within the script. It can never break free and go on to find a new story. It no longer has the freedom to break out and into reality. This narrative had to be told in a meta way for this prison to be forged. In this way, Wes crafted a scenario where this entity could never break free again. The world was safe forever. I won't say anything more on this topic, but will simply direct anyone who has not seen it yet to check out my Alan Wake 2 ending analysis. While writing the script for that one, this film popped into my head, which is why I included it in the Remedy Book Club. With all of this said, I hope you all enjoyed this installment in the series. We already have another film and another book being worked on, along with a backlog of potential pieces of literature to add in soon. If anyone has recommendations, please feel free to comment below. See you next time. Thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed, please drop a like and subscribe to receive updates on future uploads. If you would like to help support the channel, a Patreon has been set up and the link is in the description below. Have a great day and peace be with you all.